Lyddie by Katherine Paterson, Chapter 4, Frog in a Butter Churn. When Lyddie first came to the tavern, Willie built up the morning fire, but he overslept often, and several times the fire went out, and someone had to be sent to the neighbors for live coals. The mistress was too mean to invest in a tinder box, but she was mortified to be thought a careless housewife who let her kitchen fire die, so she put Lyddie in charge of it. The first few nights, Lyddie was fearful that she would not wake up early enough in her windowless room, and slept on the hearth all night, so as to be sure to be the first up in the morning. Tryphena came in one morning and found her there, but instead of scolding, took pity. A sort of friendship began that morning. The cook was past her middle years and homely. She had never married, preferring, as she said, not to be a slave to any man. She was large and vigorous, impatient with Willie, who had to be told things more than once, but as the days wore on, won over by Lyddie's hard work and quiet ways. One morning, while Lyddie was churning, just as the cream was breaking into curdles, the cook told Lyddie about the two frogs who fell into the pail of milk. One drowned right off, she said, nodding her head in the direction of the door, which had just slammed shut behind Willie's back. But the other kicked, and in the morning they found him there, floating on a big pat of butter. Lyddie smiled despite herself. Tryphena continued, some folks are natural-born kickers. They can always find a way to turn disaster into butter. We can still hop. Lyddie nearly laughed out loud. Tryphena cocked her head in question, but Lyddie only smiled and shook her head. She couldn't share Charlie's joke with someone else. Autumn came all too quickly. The days grew suddenly short, and never, though she dreamed and plotted as she scrubbed the iron kettles and churned the butter and bellowed up the fire, never a chance to take the calf money home. There was no word from Charlie. Not that she truly expected a letter. They had neither money for stationery and postage, nor the time or energy for composition. She tried to keep him in her mind, to picture as she lay upon her own cot how he was growing and what he was doing. She rarely thought of Rachel and Agnes or their mother. The three of them seemed to belong to another, sadder life. The possibility of their father's return slipped into a back corner of her mind. She wondered once if he were dead, and that was why she seldom thought of him now. There was no pain in the thought, only a kind of numb curiosity. She and Charlie had left their mother's note and notes of their own to Papa on the table in the cabin, weighted down by the heavy iron candlestick, so in case he returned he would know where they were. But the old vision of him coming up the narrow track had faded like a worn-out garment. When she realized that the dream she'd clutched for 3 years had slipped from her grasp, she wondered if she should feel bad that she had lost it. Her own voice said crossly within her head, he shouldn't have gone, he should never have left us. The flaming hills of early October died abruptly. At last the dreary rains of late fall turned into the first sputterings of snow, until the world was beautiful once more with the silver branches of the bare trees and the lush tones of the evergreens against the gleaming banks of snow, so white you had to squint your eyes against it on a sunny day. The master put the wagons and carriages in the shed and set Willie to cleaning the mud off wheels and undercarriages, and the sleds were brought out. The stagecoach came less often now. Though there was plenty of work to be done in the short winter days, there were not many guests to feed or look after. The few who came seemed as closed and secretive as the freezing grayness of the weather, bent on some narrow business of their own. Slave-catcher, Tryphena was heard to mutter after one dark, sleekly, well-dressed gentleman departed. I don't like the smell of them. If she had been home, she might have spent the dark afternoons spinning or sewing, but the mistress bought her woolens and calicoes at the village stores. She did not even card or spin the wool from their own sheep. It was sent to Nashua or Lowell, where it could be done in a gigantic water-powered mill. All the wealth that had once been Vermont's seemed to be trickling south or west. In fact, the master was heard to say that come spring the sheep would be sold, because of the western railroads were bringing such cheap wool to the Lowell factories that a New England sheep farmer could no longer compete. It was what her own father had said, but his flock had been much smaller than Cutler's, so their family had felt the pinch years sooner. One late morning, as she was peeling and cutting potatoes for the boiled noon meal, she felt a presence behind her shoulder. Then someone tweaked her right braid. She looked about, annoyed, expecting to say a sharp word to the bothersome Willie, when she saw it was Charlie. She stood up, the knife and potatoes still in her hand. "Oh," she said. "Oh, you surprised me." He was grinning. "I meant to," he said. "You look well." "You're taller," she said, but it was a lie. He looked smaller than she remembered, but he would have been pained to hear that. "How are you, Charlie?" It wasn't a pleasantry she really needed to know. "Still hoppin'," he said with a grin. "Work is slow in winter, so they let me come to see how you were." Now that she was seeing him at last, she hardly knew what to say. "Have you heard anything from Mama and the babies?" she asked. He shook his head. His hair was longer, but neater somehow. A better barber than she had trimmed it, she realized with a pang. "You're busy," he said. "I don't mean to hinder you." It was a stupid conversation, but both the cook and Willie were in the kitchen, and the mistress would be in and out. How could they say anything that mattered? "Have you been to home at all?" she asked, turning back to her work and motioning him to sit on a low stool beside her. "No," he said. "Nor you, eh?" She shook her head. She wanted to tell him about the money, how she wanted to get it safely home, ask him what she should do, but she couldn't, of course, with others about. "I saw Luke a few times," he said. "He's been up once or twice to look at the farm. The house is fine." He lowered his voice. "He had a bit of a laugh about the way we blocked the door. He had to climb in the window." She didn't like the idea of Luke or anyone else climbing in the window. It made the cabin seem less secure. A coon or a bear might climb through the window as well, or a tramp, but she didn't comment. "Do they work you hard?" she asked softly. He looked so small and thin. "They're fair. The miller works as hard as any of us hands. The food is plenty and good." "Then why aren't you bigger?" she wanted to ask him, but she held her tongue. After he had gone, she thought of 100 things she wished she had said. She could have told him about the frogs if she'd remembered to. He would have laughed, and she longed to hear his laugh. She was much lonelier after he went. His presence for an hour had rubbed off some of her protection, leaving her feeling raw and exposed. He had left about noon, carrying some bread and cheese Tryphena had pressed on him for his journey. He was wearing snowshoes that looked nearly as long as he was tall. Suppose it began to snow before he got back safely? Suppose he got lost? She tried to shake off her anxieties. Would someone let her know if something were to happen to him? It would be days, for they would let her mother know first, and then she might or might not write to Lyddie. It was too hard being separated like this. It was not right. "The weather will hold, eh?" Tryphena said, reading her mind. Lyddie sighed deeply. "You're worse than a little mother," the woman chided, but her eyes were softer than usual. The weather did hold for another 3 days, and then the blizzard of the winter came. The stock was watered and fed, the cows were milked, and there was little that Otis and Enoch, the 2 hired men, could do outdoors, so the kitchen was crowded with men, seeking the warmth of the great fire as they made spills for the March sugaring, whittling 4-inch segments of sumac, which they hollowed out with red-hot pokers. She thought of how she and Charlie had made spills last winter for tapping their own maples. Their own efforts were so childish compared to the practiced skill of these hired men. She could hardly move in the kitchen, large as it was, without tripping over the gangly legs of a man or having one of them bar her path to the fireplace with a poker. Tryphena grumbled continuously under her breath and rejoiced audibly when they left to tend to the livestock, but Lyddie didn't mind so much. Their bodies were in the way of everything she had to do, but as they worked they talked, and the talk was a welcome window into the world beyond the tavern. "They caught another slave up near Ferrisburgh. The legislature can say all they want to about not giving up runaways, but as long as them rewards are high, somebody's going to report them." "Well, you gotta decide." Enoch spat at the fire. His spit sizzled like fat on a hot griddle. "Who's in charge? Down in Washington, slavery is the law of the land. Man buys a horse fair and legal, he's sure as hell going after it if it bolts. You pay for something, it's yours. If the law says a man can own slaves, he's got a right to go after them if they bolt. Ain't no difference I can see. And if I happen to return somebody's property, seems to me I deserve a reward." Otis paused to pull his poker from the flames and thrust it smoking through the center of the sumac spill he held. "None of them high and mighty folks in Montpelier offered to pay me $100 not to report a runaway, now have they? Well, this weather they likely to be froze 'fore you find 'em. You reckon the reward holds froze or thawed? Why you suppose anyone tried to run in winter? Don't they know how easy it is to track a critter in the snow? Way I figure, it's not snowing down there where they come from, eh? They don't know what it's like up this way. They just see a chance to run, they run. They don't give it good thought." "I'd give it good thought," Lyddie said to herself. "I'd get it all figured out close and choose my time right. If I was running, I'd pick me a early summer night with a lot of moon. I'd just travel by night, sleep in the day." "Can you believe these fools?" Tryphena was saying in her ear. "They don't know what it's like to be trapped." Lyddie had never seen a black person. She tried to imagine how one might look and act. In a way, she'd like to see one, but what would she do? What would she say? And supposing it was a fugitive, what then? $100! Would they really give you $100 for turning in a runaway slave? Surely, with that much money, she could pay off her father's debts and go back home. March came. The sap began to rise in the sugar bush, and Cutler's was in a frenzy of activity. Willie went with the hired men to help in the gathering and boiling of the sap. Mr. Cutler had built a large sugaring shed 2 summers ago, and the only time any of the men were around the big house was when the livestock needed tending to. Even then, Lyddie was called on to help with the milking and the feeding and watering of the stock. Added to all her other chores was the task of clarifying the syrup brought up to the house. They had never bothered much with clarifying at the farm, as there had hardly been enough syrup or sugar for the family, but the mistress was very particular and stood over Lyddie, directing her. It was hot and exhausting work, beating milk and ash lye with syrup and boiling the mixture until the impurities rose to the top in a scum and could be skimmed off. But the mistress, who only watched and commanded, declared the light, clear syrup worth the effort. Some of the clarified syrup was boiled until it turned to sugar and was molded into fancy shapes. Lyddie's favorite among the moles was the head of George Washington, though sometimes the nose stuck and it was ruined. It was because of the molded sugar that Lyddie's dream of taking the calf money home came true, though she couldn't have known how that dream was going to come out. Chapter 5, Going Home. By the 2nd week of April, the sap had ceased to run, but it had been a good sugaring season. The mistress decided to take a large selection of the molded maple sugar to Boston. She could pay for her trip by selling the sugar, and it would give her a chance to see the big city and her perpetually ailing sister. Work did not disappear with the departure of the mistress, but it became as pleasant as a holiday. If I could make life so happy for others just by going away, I'd go more often, Tryphena said. In 2 weeks, Lyddie and Tryphena and Willie, when they could catch him, turned the huge house inside out with scrubbing and cleaning. It smelled as good as the air of coming spring, and though there was a bit of fresh snow toward the end of the month, Lyddie knew it for the sham winter it was. Spring could not be denied forever. "Well," said the cook one night, "the mistress earned herself a trip. I think the rest of us have too." "Where will you go, eh?" asked Lyddie wistfully. "Me," Tryphena said. She was knitting, and her worn red hands fairly flew over the yarn. "I got no place I want to visit. I've been to Montpelier twice. That's enough. Boston's too big and too dirty. I wouldn't like it. Where would you go?" "Home," said Lyddie, her voice no more than a whisper. "Home? But that's hardly 10 miles. Lyddie nodded. "It might as well be 10,000. "You can go and be back in no more than a couple of days at most." What was the woman saying? "Go on. Tomorrow, if you like." Lyddie couldn't believe her ears. "But who's going to care with the mistress gone?" She turned to the row and began to purl without ever looking down. "Would it be all right?" "If I say so," Tryphena said. "With her gone, I'm in charge, eh?" Lyddie wasn't going to argue. If you was to wait, the ground would thaw to mud. Better go tomorrow if it's fair. Take a little sugar to your brother on the way. Lyddie opened her mouth to ask again if it would be all right, but decided not to. If Tryphena said she could go, who was Lyddie to question? She was up before the sun, but she could tell the day would be a good one. She took a lunch bucket of bread and cheese and a little packet of molded sugar. The snow in the roadway was already turning to mud, and she slung a pair of snowshoes on her back in case the tracks up the mountain were still deep in snow. She reached the mill in less than an hour, but to her disappointment, Charlie was not there. "I think he's off somewheres," one of the men said, "but you can ask up at the house." A pretty, rather plump woman answered Lyddie's knock. "Yes," she said, but she was smiling. "I come to see Charles Worthen." Lyddie seemed to stumble over the words, which made her flush with embarrassment. "I'm his sister." "Of course," the woman said. "Come in." Lyddie stopped to leave her snowshoes and lunch bucket on the porch, then followed the woman into a large, fragrant kitchen. "I was just starting dinner," the woman said, as if in apology, as she hurried to stir the stew bubbling over the fire in the stone fireplace. "Charles is at school today." She replaced the lid on the kettle. "He's a very bright boy." "Yes," said Lyddie. She would not be envious of Charlie. They were nearly the same person, weren't they? "My husband is growing very fond of him." What did she mean? Who was growing fond of Charlie? Charlie was not their child, not even their apprentice. She felt the need to explain to the woman that Charlie belonged to her, but she couldn't figure out how. "Just tell him I was here, eh?" she said awkwardly. At the door, she remembered the sugar and shoved it at the woman. "Some sugar," she mumbled. "We'd be happy for you to stay a while," the woman said, but Lyddie was already picking up her things. "I have to go," she said. "Not much time." She realized later that she had forgotten to say thank you, but there was no going back. Besides, she was in a hurry to get to the farm. She'd have time to clean the house well and check the roofs, as well as find a good place to hide the money. She'd just spend the night there, as it would be almost dark by the time she got everything done. If she got an early start the next day, perhaps she could stop by once more at the mill. But no, she couldn't stop by again and ask for Charlie and have him at school again. What would they think of her? And it might embarrass Charlie to have his sister clucking over him like an old biddy hen. She couldn't stand the thought of Charlie being mortified by her in front of these people who thought so highly of him. Well, she was glad. Hadn't she felt bad that he didn't have a father and mother like Luke Stevens had to watch over him? But these weren't his real family. She was his real family. More than their mother, really, who had shucked them off like corn husks to follow her craziness. Her anger, or whatever emotion it was that kept her head reeling, kept her feet moving as well. She was walking past the Stevensons' farm by noon. She never stopped to eat, but on the last leg of the trip she suddenly realized her hunger and chewed on the now hard roll and dry cheese as she climbed the narrow track toward the farm. There was still plenty of snow on the track, but it was better packed than she had imagined. Mr. Westcott must be going back and forth to see to his cows, and then she realized there was snow on the pastures. There'd be no animals up in the fields, but of course the sugaring. He had gone back and forth gathering sap from the sugar bush. When she rounded the bend, she half expected the cabin to have disappeared, but there it sat, sagging a bit, squat and honest as her father had built it. The firewood was stacked against the door as she and Charlie had left it. The roofs seemed undamaged from the snow, thanks perhaps to Luke Stevens. Those must be his tracks around the cabin. She felt kindly toward the tall, awkward young Quaker for taking care. She fetched the short ladder from the shed and propped it against one of the two south windows. Then she fetched a piece of split wood from the pile at the front door. The window should be easy to pry open unless it had swollen, but it hadn't. Indeed, it seemed to open quite smoothly, as though welcoming her home. Lyddie propped it up with the wood. She put her right leg over the sill and scrunched her head down onto her chest to squeeze into the opening. Then she saw it at the fireplace, a shadowy form. She stifled a scream. "Luke," she whispered, "that you?" The form turned and stood up. She could barely make it out in the gloom of the cabin. It was a tall man, but not Luke. There was a strange man in her home. The whites of his eyes seemed enormous, and then she realized what was so strange about him. In the dim light, his face and hands were very dark. Only his eyes shone. She was looking at a black man. Chapter 6, Ezekiel. With one leg over the windowsill and her body pressed up under the window frame, there seemed no way to run. But why should she run? It was her house, after all, and what was one measly man, black or white, compared to a bear? Besides, she broke into a cold sweat. This man was likely to be worth $100. Keeping her eyes on the intruder as though he were a bear, she managed to get her left foot across the sill and straighten herself to a sitting position on the window ledge. Pretending courage seemed to manufacture it, so she was just about to open her mouth to ask the man who he was and what he was doing in her house when he spoke to her. "Verily, verily, I say unto you, he that entereth not by the door, but climbeth up some other way, the same is a thief and a robber." His voice was deep and smooth, almost like thick brushed fur. She knew his words were from the Bible, but she was so astonished by the music of them that she sat there open-mouthed, unable to protest that whatever he might be, she was no thief. "Never fear, little miss. My heart assures me that you're neither a thief nor a robber." "No," she said, and then louder to show her authority, "I'm mistress here." "Ah," he said, "we meet at last. You must be Miss Lydia Worthen, my hostess. Forgive my intrusion." "How do you know my name, eh?" She had meant to ask his, or at least what he was doing in her house, but as before, he'd gotten the better of her with his fancy talk and quick mind. "Brother Stevens," he said. He felt you would be understanding. He glanced at her, and for the first time since he had spied her at the window, his expression seemed uncertain. I hope he was not mistaken. He smiled apologetically. "Here, do come down from there and share a cup of tea with me. You've had a long journey, I'd imagine, and a rude shock finding your home occupied by a stranger." What else was she to do? She took the hand he held out to her, surprised by its roughness, as his skin looked like satin in the dim light. He helped her to the floor. She followed as he led her to the rocker, and then she sat perched on the edge of the chair as he handed her a cup of birch tea. Why hadn't she spied smoke coming up the road? But the man's fire was tiny, so perhaps there was none to see. The cabin was cold, though warmer than the outdoors. The man poured himself a cup and pulled up a stool on the other side of the fireplace to sit down facing her. "You've come from the village," he said. She nodded. The man could hardly be a runaway slave. He talked like a congregational preacher, but he was in hiding, that was plain. "I should introduce myself," he said, reading her mind. "I'm Ezekiel Abernathy, or was so called formerly. I was on the way northward when the snow delayed me last November." Then he was a fugitive. "I was conveyed to Brother Stevens's farm, where I stayed until it became clear that someone was watching their farm. That was when young Luke spirited me here. He thought your log pile at the door would discourage curiosity. We done it to keep out wild critters." "Yes," he said, "and you succeeded. I've been quite safe from wild ones here." He took a sip of his tea, keeping his eyes on the rim of the cup. "So far." He glanced up at her. "I would have left at once, but I was inconveniently ill. In the cold, my lungs have been slow to clear." "You talk like a preacher." He relaxed a little. "Well, I am, or rather I was." "Then you ain't a slave?" "Some have considered me a slave. But you talk nice." She hadn't meant to put it that way, but it came out unthought. He smiled. "So do you." "No," she said. "I mean, you've had schooling." "I was my own schoolmaster," he said. "At first I only wanted to read the Bible so I could preach to my people. But," he smiled again, showing his lovely even teeth, "a little reading is an exceedingly dangerous thing." "Reading the Bible?" "Especially the Bible," he said. "It gave me notions." "So you just left, eh? Just set out walking?" He leaned his head back, remembering. "Something like that," he said, but she could tell from his eyes that it was nothing like that at all. "I couldn't leave my home," she said. "No? And yet you did." "I had no choice," she said hotly. "I was made to." "So many slaves," he said softly. "I ain't a slave," she said. I just what?" "There was the debt my father left, so—" Whatever she said only made it seem worse. "But we own the land. We're free men of the state of Vermont." He looked at her. "Well, my father is, or was, till he left, and my brother will be. But Charlie was at school and living with strangers." She hated the man for making her think this way. "I left the only home I knew," he said quietly. "I left a wife and child behind, vowing I would send for them or come for them within a few months. And here I sit, sick and penniless, hiding for my life, totally dependent on the kindnesses of others for everything." He shook his head, and she was sorry she had had a moment's hate of him. Somewhere, perhaps, her father was saying those very same words. After a while he stood up. "I can offer you a little rabbit stew," he said. "I'm afraid that's about all I have at the moment. Brother Luke will be coming up tonight with more food, I think. But if you're hungry—" "I have some bread and cheese," she said. "A veritable feast," he said, his good humor returned. "When I first saw you—" They were eating, and somehow she needed to let him know. "I thought—" But she was ashamed to finish the sentence. "It's a lot of money," he said gently. "I'd be tempted myself if I were you." She could feel herself go hot and red. "But I won't," she said fiercely. "Now I know you, I couldn't ever." "Thank you," he said, "a compliment as beautiful as the giver." "It's dark in here," Lyddie said, "or you could see I'm plain as sod. Or lovely as the earth." He used such fancy words, but she knew he wasn't using words to make fun of her. Luke did come in the night, but she had slept so soundly that she didn't hear him. The proof was the odor of porridge bubbling over the fire when she awoke. She had slept in her clothes and scrambled down the loft ladder at once. "Ah, the sleeper awaketh." "It's late," she said. "I have to go." But he made her wait long enough to eat. It was a strange goodbye. She did not hope to see Ezekiel again. She hoped that he could cross the border fast as a fox, far away from the snares of those who would trap him. How could she have imagined for 1 minute that she could betray him? "I hope you get to Canada safe," she said, "and I hope your family can join you real soon." And then, without even thinking, she thrust her hand into her pocket and held out to him the calf money bag. "You might need something along the way," she said. The coins jangled as she passed them over. "But this is yours. You'll need it. You earned it." "No," she said, "I didn't earn it. It come from selling the calf. I was only going to bury it till it was needed." "Will you think of it as a loan, then?" he asked. "When I get established, I'll send it to you care of the Stevenses, with interest if I can." There's no hurry. Wait till your family comes. I don't know when my brother and I can ever get back." She felt leaden with sadness. She pushed the stool to the window and climbed up. He held the window open as she climbed out. Someone, Luke perhaps, had left the short ladder in place. "I can never thank you, my friend," Ezekiel said. "It was half Stevenson's calf by rights," she said, trying to diminish for both of them the enormity of what she had done. "It was their bull." "I hope you find your freedom as well, Miss Lydia," he said. It wasn't until she was well down the road that she began to try to figure out what he had meant, and he was right. At Cutler's, despite Tryphaena's friendship, she was no more than a slave. She worked from before dawn until well after dark, and what did she have to show for it? She was no closer to paying off the debt and coming home than she'd been a year ago. She needed cash money for that. She needed work that would pay and pay well, and there was only one place in New England where a girl could get a good cash wage for her work, and that was in Lowell, in the mills. The weather held and the trip back was mostly downhill, so she was back by early afternoon. She hung the unused snowshoes in the shed and the lunch bucket in the pantry before she entered the warm kitchen. "So, you've decided to honor us with a visit." The mistress's face was red with heat or rage. Behind her, Tryphaena grimaced an apology. She stood in the doorway, trying to frame an excuse or apology, but as usual, the words did not come quickly enough to mind. "You're dismissed," the woman said. "The best one you ever had," Tryphaena muttered, "unless—" "No," Lyddie said quickly. "I know I done wrong to go off when you wasn't here. I'll just collect my things and be gone, eh? You're wearing my dress." "Yes, ma'am. Shall I wash it before I go, or—" "Don't be impertinent." Lyddie went past the angry woman without a word and up the back staircase to her tiny windowless room. She pulled off the calico dress and put on the tight homespun, but it was like laying off a great burden. She felt more light-hearted than she had since the day Mrs. Peck brought the letter. Tryphaena had followed her up. "Just stay out of sight today. By tomorrow she'll have come to her senses. She knows you're the best worker she's ever likely to get, and at no price at all. Why, she sends your mother 50 cents a week, and then only if I remind her." "I'm going to be a factory girl, Tryphaena." "You what?" "I'm free. She set me free. I can do anything I want. I can go to Lowell and make real money to pay off the debt so I can go home. But your brother, he'll be all right. He's in a good place where he's cared for. They're even letting him go to school." "How can you get to Massachusetts? You've no money for coach fare." "I'll walk," she said proudly. "A person should walk to freedom." "A person's feet will get mighty sore," muttered Tryphaena.